kingdom of Aravind was known across the lands for its prosperity, wealth, and glittering palaces. But beneath the surface it was the wisdom of its ruler, King Dharan, that held the nation together like invisible threads weaving a vast tapestry. And though many kings boasted of their conquests, their battles, their eloquence in the courts, King Dharan was remembered most not for what he said but for what he withheld. For he was a king who believed in silence, and in a world where rulers shouted commands and boomed their voices to enforce obedience, his stillness carried a weight far greater than thunder. When Dharan was a child, he was unlike others, for while his siblings competed to impress their tutors with clever recitations and dramatic gestures, he would sit quietly, observing, listening, letting the murmurs of others flow into him like streams feeding a deep lake. And once, when a quarrel broke out between two scholars in the palace library, Dharan said nothing, but simply watched as their anger exhausted itself. And when they realized he had not intervened or argued, they paused, embarrassed, then reconciled without a single royal word uttered. And so the boy learned that silence had a way of cooling fires that words might fan. When he grew into a prince, the ministers worried he was too passive, too restrained, for during debates he would sit motionless, fingers steepled, eyes calm, while others rattled off endless speeches. Yet whenever decisions were required, his judgment struck with precision as though he had absorbed every word, weighed every motive, and distilled the essence of truth in his silence. And people began whispering that the quiet prince had a mind like a mirror that reflected everything yet distorted nothing. When Dharan finally ascended the throne, the kingdom braced itself for change. For a monarch's tongue can raise armies, sway treaties, or doom lives. But Dharan ruled with an unusual presence. For in court, when nobles petitioned him, he listened without interruption, sometimes letting minutes pass in silence after they finished speaking, and this pause made them tremble. For in the absence of words, they heard their own voices echo, often realizing their requests were selfish or flawed before he even responded. And sometimes he gave no response at all, merely a gentle nod, leaving them to wrestle with their own conscience. This style unsettled the foreign ambassadors, for they were used to kings who puffed their chests and thundered with promises. Yet Dharan's quiet gaze disarmed them, forcing them to reveal more than they intended, because when met with silence, people filled the void with their own truths, spilling secrets in their haste to escape the unbearable calm. One legendary tale describes a general who betrayed the king, conspiring with a rival state, and when caught, he expected a furious trial, accusations hurled, threats of punishment, but Dharan only summoned him to the throne room and sat silently, eyes steady, lips unmoving, until the general's bravado crumbled and he confessed every detail of his treachery, begging forgiveness, broken not by words but by the unshakable quiet that forced him to face himself. Ministers marveled, courtiers whispered, and gradually the people began to understand that silence was the king's most powerful weapon. For words may deceive, but silence never lies. In time, stories spread of how Dharan would walk among his citizens in disguise, sitting in tea houses, in markets, in fields, saying nothing, merely listening. And because he did not speak, people forgot his presence and spoke freely of their struggles, their joys, their grievances, and thus the king learned more about his land than any report could reveal, all because he allowed silence to be his companion. Yet not all admired him, for some mistook his restraint for weakness, and a rival king, Varun, boasted that Dharan's silence proved cowardice, declaring that a ruler must roar like a lion, and so he challenged Dharan to a grand debate before both courts, promising that whoever triumphed would earn dominance over the borderlands they disputed. The day came, the hall filled with nobles, warriors, scholars, and citizens eager to witness the clash of words. Varun launched into fiery rhetoric, ridiculing Dharan, mocking his stillness, accusing him of passivity, while Dharan sat unmoved, his silence as deep as a mountain lake. And as Varun continued his tirade, his voice grew louder, harsher, until sweat dripped from his brow and murmurs rose in the hall, for the crowd noticed how undignified he appeared, while Dharan's quiet poise radiated strength. Finally exhausted, Varun paused, demanding Dharan answer, but Dharan merely looked at the people, then slowly raised his hand, gesturing for silence, though none were speaking. and in that stillness the audience reflected upon what they had witnessed. One man raging, the other unshaken, and they realized which figure carried true authority. The hall erupted in acclaim for Dharan, who had won the debate without a single word, and Varun left humiliated, defeated not by argument, but by silence itself. Years passed and Dharan's legend grew, yet the king himself remained humble, for he knew silence was not the absence of voice but the presence of listening, and he taught his children that words are like arrows. Once loosed, they cannot return, but silence is like the bow, shaping the arrow's power, restraining it until the right moment, and thus silence guides speech rather than suppresses it. One evening, a plague struck a nearby village and panic spread, with villagers clamoring for answers, fearful of death, demanding proclamations. But Dharan visited them without pomp, sitting quietly among the sick, holding their hands, sharing their stillness, and his calm presence reassured them more than speeches ever could, for in silence they felt seen, not managed. When the healers eventually cured the plague, people said it was not only medicine but also the king's silence that saved them. For fear feeds on noise but starves in stillness. In the twilight of his reign, as Dharan sat on the palace balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, his eldest son asked him why he had chosen silence all his life, when he had the power to speak and command. And Dharan smiled faintly, replying at last in one of his rare utterances, "My son, words are many but truth is one. Silence is the path that leads us there." And those words, because they were rare, fell like jewels upon the boy's heart, shaping the dynasty for generations. And so history remembered Dharan not as the king who spoke, but as the king who listened in silence, proving to the world that while words can move crowds, silence can move souls, and in the stillness of a listening heart lies a power greater than armies, greater than gold, greater than all the proclamations ever shouted from a throne. For silence is not emptiness but fullness, not weakness but strength, not absence but presence. And thus the legacy of King Dharan endured, whispered across centuries in reverence. That a king who listened in silence taught humanity that silence itself is the most powerful voice of all. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, give it a like, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspirational stories and motivation content. Until next time, take care of yourself.